Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to give my review of WCW Sold Out 1998. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is Lizmark Jr., Chavo Guerrero, Juventud Guerrera, and Super Calo versus La Parka, Silver King, Psychosis, and El Dandy. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Lizmark, Guerrero, Guerrera, and Super Calo keeping the pace of the match. Guerrero then hits a Hurricane Rana off the top rope on La Parka. Calo then hits a head scissors takedown off the top rope. Guerrero then hits a 450 splash off the top rope on Silver King. La Parka then hits a powerbomb on Guerrera. Guerrero then hits a tornado DDT on Psychosis. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Lizmark Jr., Chavo Guerrero, Juventud Guerrera, and Super Calo. Hats off to Lizmark Jr., Guerrero, Guerrera, and Super Calo for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Raven versus Chris Benoit. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Raven and Benoit, with Raven keeping the pace of the match. Benoit then hits a diving headbutt on Raven for a near fall, but Raven gets up, hits a DDT on Benoit. But Benoit gets up, applies his signature crossface on Raven, and your winner of the match by submission is Chris Benoit. Hats off to Chris Benoit for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Chris Jericho. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between both Mysterio and Jericho, with Jericho keeping the pace of the match. But Jericho ultimately applies his signature Lion Tamer on Mysterio, and your winner of the match by submission is Chris Jericho. Hats off to Chris Jericho for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Television Championship. It is Rick Martel versus Booker T. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Martel and Booker T, with Martel keeping the pace of the match. Booker T then hits a scissors kick on Martel, and Booker T ultimately hits his signature Harlem Hangover on Rick Martel, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Booker T. Hats off to Booker T for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Larry Zbyszko versus Scott Hall. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Zbyszko and Hall, with Hall keeping the pace of the match. Zbyszko then applies a guillotine choke on Hall, but NWO members make their way out to the ring to attack Zbyszko, and your winner of the match by disqualification is Larry Zbyszko. After the match, Dusty Rhodes attacks Zbyszko, and then ultimately Dusty Rhodes joins the NWO. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the NWO versus Ray Taylor and the Steiners. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between the NWO and Taylor and Steiners, with the NWO keeping the pace of the match. But Scott Steiner ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Ray Taylor and the Steiner brothers. Hats off to Ray Taylor and the Steiner brothers for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Kevin Nash versus the Giant. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between the Giant and Nash, with Giant keeping the pace of the match. Nash then throws hot coffee into the Giant's face, which allows Kevin Nash to hit a devastating jackknife powerbomb on the Giant. Pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Kevin Nash. Hats off to Kevin Nash for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ric Flair versus Bret Hart. This was Hart's WCW pay-per-view debut. The match itself was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Flair and Hart, with Hart applying a figure 4 leg lock on Flair, but Flair breaks the hold. Flair then was keeping the pace of the match, with him applying his own figure 4 leg lock on Hart, but Hart quickly breaks the hold, and Bret Hart ultimately applies his signature sharpshooter on Ric Flair, and your winner of the match by submission is Bret Hart. Hats off to Bret Hart for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW Sold Out 1998. It is Lex Luger versus Randy Savage. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Lex and Randy Savage, with Randy keeping the pace of the match. But Lex Luger ultimately applies his signature torture rack on Randy Savage. And your winner of the match by submission is Lex Luger. A couple of things I'm going to say about Sold Out 1998 before I get out of here, man. Number one, this was a decent event. There's some matches on here that I actually enjoyed. Raven versus Chris Benoit was a solid matchup. The Cruiserweight Championship match between Mysterio Jr. and Jericho was absolutely an awesome match. Rick Martel versus Booker T. The one interesting thing I'll say about this match between Martel and Booker T, that Martel had a long layoff. Obviously, from the times he was in WWE all the way up to WCW, he had a decent layoff. And for what it's worth, I think if Martel would have came in a little bit earlier in the WCW, I think Martel really could have had a really good career in WCW. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I look at, people like Rick Rude. Rick Rude made a big name for himself as well as over WWE and WCW. Now, obviously, in the later years of WCW, he really wasn't wrestling for, WCW. He was more like a bodyguard or a manager for the NWO. But in the early days of WCW, Rick Rude was a multi-time world champion. Even in WWE, he's multi-time Intercontinental Champion. Rick Rude had a great career for himself in WCW, and I think the same thing would have happened for Rick Martel. I mean, coming in as a heel. Honestly, I think for what it's worth, I think at that time WCW needed a lot more heels than baby faces, and I think if Martel would have just came over in the early 90s or mid to late 80s, I think Martel would have had a hell of a career for himself in WCW. Larry Zbyszko versus Scott Hall. Larry Zbyszko, the living legend. It was an okay matchup. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm the biggest Larry Zbyszko fan. I'm not going to sit here and say that, but it was cool to see Zbyszko in the ring. Larry Zbyszko's had a lot of really good matches, most notable the one with Bruno Sammartino, which gave him the nickname, the living legend. But all in all, it was an okay matchup. I mean, you're not going to get anything super crazy between, Zbyszko and Scott Hall. NWO versus Ray Taylor and the Steiners. It was a solid matchup from top to bottom. One of the matches that honestly impressed me, well, two of the biggest matches that impressed me, was Kevin Nash versus the Giant, mainly because in that match, that jackknife powerbomb that Nash had landed on the Giant, man, it looked absolutely brutal. I mean, the Giant landed right on the back of his neck. Looked absolutely brutal. In a dream match, Ric Flair versus Bret Hart, man. This is a match that a lot of fans at that time even wanted. Two absolute legends, two Hall of Famers, and it was one of the best matches of the night. Honestly, I think that match between Ric Flair and Bret Hart was the match of the night for me, personally. Made for a great match. Both guys gelled in the ring perfectly together, and it told a hell of a story. So I think Ric Flair versus Bret Hart for WCW Sold Out 1998 was my favorite match of that entire card. With that being said, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of a 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give WCW Sold Out 1998 a solid rating of a 5.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW Sold Out 1998. I hope you guys are out there staying safe, be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.